Thank you, Paul and Anna, for the introduction, the warm welcome. I'm delighted to be here, and it's great to see so many of you here with us for this discussion. So the title of the session is Gen Z Ethical Consumers Closing the Attitude-Behaviour Gap. I'd just like to talk to you, probably just like 20 minutes, and we'll go very quickly, but I need to talk to you to kind of set the scene for this before we open up our discussion. Just put some context around the topic, introduce the research that was done on this, share some of the key findings on Gen Z's attitudes towards sustainability and their ethical behaviours. And at the centre of this is going to be this key concept of the attitude-behaviour gap. It's also called the value-action gap, simply the difference between what consumers say versus what they do. So I'll share some perspective on what's going on with this gap, what's influencing the size of the gap. I'll have some statistical evidence and some expert opinion to support this. And then we'll have a bit of a broader discussion about what some of the implications are and solutions.
Could I just ask?
Yeah, go on.
Could I just one question actually, just before we kick off actually, is how many of you, if you put your little hands up, are actually working with Gen Z type audiences at the moment, or people within the Gen Z audience? Right, quite a few actually. Right, so quite a lot of, so that should be quite interesting, because it'd be interesting to get the feedback later from how you're seeing it when your clients come to you and say, you know, we want to target Gen Z, as I've seen on actual briefs saying Gen Z, and you go, okay, who are you really talking about?
And how many Gen Zers have we got on the call? And a Gen Z is someone aged between 9 and 24.
Well, we might have my 7-year-old come in a minute, but he's Gen Alpha.
Oh, right, okay. I thought you put your hand up then, Chris. No, you're not Gen Zer.
Well, my wife thinks I've got the mentality of a Gen Z, I have to say.
There's a few that haven't put their camera on.
Okay, good stuff. Okay, so Gen Z it's 9 to 24 age group. We're interested in Gen Z as active consumers between the ages of 18 and 24. Of course, we're interested in Gen Zers from the perspective of them being future consumers. So when they grow and earn more money and become more affluent and have their own homes, you know, what impact are they going to have on the growth of the ethical retail market, and also the adoption of sustainable behaviours like recycling and conscious consumption and that kind of thing. Now, when you read the media today, there is this bias that Gen Z is the generation that is most interested in adopting sustainability into their lifestyles and are more likely to be socially responsible consumers. And there's a lot, and maybe you disagree, but I think there's a lot of optimism out there about this perceived change of attitudes in Gen Z. And there's a lot of stuff going on with this group. I mean, we've had the Greta Thunberg effect. We've had a huge interest in initiatives like COP26. Very visible boycotting from this group, even though some of the boycotting is short-lived. And there's also some trends coming out of Gen Z. Thrift flipping, I don't know if you've heard of that. It's massive on TikTok. It's where you take old clothes and materials and kind of get the sewing machine and make them into new outfits. So that's something that Gen Z is driving forward. And as a group of consumers, they seem to be really engaged and really informed in these issues. They've been very vocal online and expressing their values intensely, you know, get involved in protests and consumer action. So I wanted to investigate what was going on and conduct some research on this, and fundamentally ask the questions, you know, what's going on behind Gen Z's heightened engagement in ethical issues? Is Gen Z actually the most ethically minded generation when you compare them to other age groups or not? And then importantly, when we think about all these attitudes and expressed values, how much is actually translating into behaviours and actions? So that was kind of the purpose for the research. I'll talk to you about some of the key findings. There's a lot. I could probably talk for 2 hours about the findings in this research. It was so in depth, but I'll talk to you about some key findings, unpack them a little bit, and then we'll have a bit of discussion about what these mean and some of the solutions. So the main finding from this research, drum roll, ... is that it challenges this bias that Gen Z are consumers that are more ethically minded. It did confirm that within Gen Z, there is high engagement, there's an appreciation of the issues. That said, this research was done amongst students, so you kind of expect that. It may not be the same for the whole of the Gen Z population. But what it did show is that Gen Z are less likely to pay a high premium for ethical products. They're less committed to practicing regular positive ethical behaviours such as purchasing, recycling, consuming less. And the research found that Gen Z is actually the most wasteful age group. Now, this really surprised me, given what Gen Z talk about and how important the environment is. When it comes to ethical purchasing specifically, when you look at the attitude behaviour gap, the difference between what consumers say and what they do, it's actually widening for Gen Z, not narrowing. And the narrowest gap was for baby boomers. So again, that might be a surprise. And when measuring the attitude behaviour gap for ethical purchasing, the measures used were looking at the percentage of consumers that say they make purchasing decisions based on values and principles, which are personal, social, environmental, versus actual sales. That's how we kind of make that measure. But actually, the most ethical generation from positive ethical behaviours is the over 55s. It's not Gen Z. Another interesting fact is the over 55s are the biggest purchasers of secondhand clothing, not millennials and Gen Z. And again, that was a real surprise for me. Another thing the research looked at was kind of profiling consumers based on their likelihood to adopt sustainable lifestyle choices. And it did find that within Gen Z, there's more of what we call eco-considerers, 64% versus 40% of average consumers. Now, eco-considerers are people that aren't dismissers, i.e. they don't think sustainability is very important, that they're not doing anything that's sustainable, they don't really give a monkeys. And then on the other end, you've got eco-actives who are a lot more conscientious and committed and being sustainable. They're not in those two camps, they're in the middle, they're considerers. So they're well informed, they can resonate with living sustainably, but for the reasons that we're going to explore, they're not walking the talk. And even students, which this research was focused on, who are really engaged in these issues, and there's a lot of resonance there, a lot of it isn't converting into actual behaviours. So this does tell us that actually there's a number of these consumers, young consumers, that could be open to changing their behaviours with more options and support. So this is a really important thing for us to think about, and we'll talk about that when we talk about solutions about closing the gap. Social media, I want to mention about social media because this was a bit of a bombshell in the research, because we know that social media has a huge influence in terms of shaping attitudes and driving engagement across all consumer groups, particularly in Gen Z. To bust one myth, there are actually more social media users in millennials and Gen Z age groups than there are in Gen Z. We seem to think that all Gen Z use social media, but that's not necessarily the case. But what the research did find, that out of those Gen Zers that do use social media, a larger proportion of them, 40%, are using social media to share and like content about ethical issues, take part in online petitions, get involved in boycotting and calling out brands online. They're doing this more than other age groups. Millennials came second at 34%, but up there at the top was Gen Z at about 40%. But this is the real surprise from the research. The research found statistically that all of this social media activity of Gen Z, all this engagement in consumer action online, is not correlated with positive ethical behaviours. It's actually negatively correlated. So flips on its head. So what this tells us is that Gen Z as a generation and age group, they're using social media more as a communications tool to express their values or part of their self-branding. It's not a precursor activity for intended sustainable behaviours. And so we need to be careful that we're not predicting the demand for ethical products or the readiness to adopt sustainable behaviours based on Gen Z's, vocal activity online. So that was quite a fundamental finding that came out of this research. And also the research showed that Gen Z, they prefer to express themselves with negative behaviours than positive behaviours. Negative behaviours such as boycotting, which is an anti-consumption behaviour. So they're doing a lot more of this than other age groups. That was quite a standout finding. And actually Ethical Consumer Org said last year boycotting was up by 18%. Whether that's all down to Gen Z, I don't know, but that's quite an interesting finding. So what we have here is we have a generation that overall, they prefer to punish brands for unethical business practices by boycotting rather than reward brands for their ethics by purchasing an ethical product over available alternatives. So I think that's quite an interesting dynamic there that you may not have thought of, or you may not have considered. I'll just talk about some of the reasons for the gap, and then there's four key reasons for the gap, and then we'll broaden up the discussion to talk about some of the solutions. So the reasons for the gap: why is the gap widening for Gen Z? Why do we have this gap? Well, the ethical consumption gap is common with all consumers. Let's not pick on Gen Z, it's the same for all consumers. There's always going to be a big gap between someone's intent and what they actually do. Part of this is due to something what we call social desirability bias. So it's how people feel a social pressure to act a certain way, especially when they answer survey questions or how they behave in focus groups. You're going to get a bit of that. Potentially, this is more pronounced for Gen Z because they are more image conscious, but there is a bit of that. The other reasons are complicated. They're both personal, they're both situational, but there are some prominent things that statistically have been found to have an influence on intent and behaviours for Gen Z. So there's the four major ones. The first one is cost, affordability, and high price premiums. So this should come as no surprise, really, because Gen Z out of all age groups has the lowest level of disposable income in the UK, according to the Office of National Statistics. Deloitte as well, a big report last year, said that over half of Gen Z say they live pay packet to pay packet. So this isn't a surprise. The willingness to pay a price premium for ethical products is often cited as one of the justifications for the gap. It's like the moment of truth. This research found that Gen Z's tolerance for paying a price premium for ethical products is 10 to 20%. And if you compare this to the average markup premiums of ethical products, which is 75 to 85%, you can clearly see it's just not affordable. And actually for fashion, beauty and health, the key spending categories for Gen Z, the price markups average 150 to 200%. So, this is where we have a big issue. These premium price models for ethical products are just not accessible for young consumers. The next factor that is influencing the gap, which is really significant for Gen Z, is this kind of construct of what we call sacrifice and commitment. And this is a biggie for all consumers, but particularly for Gen Z. They're a very conflicted group of consumers, and they've got conflicting priorities, things that they don't want to sacrifice, for ethics, things like price, fashion, brand, the need for convenience. All of these things are going to come before ethics in a purchasing decision. So when surveyed, 75% of Gen Z said they will prioritise fashion before ethics, 43% said brand, 66% said product durability. And so you get all these conflicting behaviours within Gen Z. I mean, even the ones that said they would not buy unethically produced clothing, they also confess that they buy fast fashion. And this is also a generation that likes the idea of sustainable clothing, secondhand clothing, but it also is the generation that is multi-buying, buying clothes once, returning or throwing them in the bin. So these contradictory behaviours are to do with this sacrifice and commitment aspect. Some things are just too hard to give up for Gen Z, especially if they're cheap. And then lastly, we've got this idea of habits and planning. This is pronounced for Gen Z. It's too difficult for them to do the planning to live sustainably, to do the lifestyle stage. And then we have their perception of difficulty buying ethical products, a lack of trust. Now this came up a lot in the focus groups. It was a really prominent thing that came up in discussions. Gen Z generally are very skeptical of retailers' ethical promises. When surveyed, less than half of them, 38%, think that companies communicate honestly about sustainability claims. And 54%, over half, feel they don't have a reliable way to verify sustainability claims. So this is a big issue, and Gen Z is a group. I mean, I spoke to hundreds of students. They're really savvy. They're really savvy about things that are overpriced, greenwashing, unsubstantiated claims. They really want transparency and authenticity from brands. And this, and I'll end on this last barrier, because this links to lack of trust. And this is really interesting. This is a psychological trait, which is called perceived consumer effectiveness, PCE. Now, this is the extent to which a consumer believes that their individual effort, their purchase, or their action contributes to the solution of the problem. And PCE, perceived consumer effectiveness, in previous research has been found to be a strong antecedent of responsible purchasing behaviour in millennials. Now, this research found it was really pronounced for Gen Z. Actually, it found it was a predictor. It was the predictor of Gen Z's ethical behaviours. I think it's more pronounced for Gen Z because they're more frugal, they need to justify the extra expense, and they're very sceptical also of product claims. So this provides an explanation, one of the explanations for the gap. What it's telling us is there are a number of Gen Z consumers that they're not convinced that their individual purchases or actions are affecting the bigger issues. And that's, stopping them from converting their intent into behaviours. So I'll stop it there. I'll leave that with you just to digest. So those are some of the key findings that have come back from the research in terms of the gap and the reasons for causing the gap.
I think a couple of things I'd like to add actually to this. I think obviously creating target audiences by birth is nothing new. We have astrology, for example, in the Chinese calendar. And I sometimes wonder if that wouldn't be a better way of using to actually target our audience. We worked with one of the big drinks companies a couple of years ago on a responsible drinking campaign. I have to say what I was quite shocked by this very large company was, again, they didn't really in touch reality. They had lots and lots of myths about what they thought this audience was, and they were reading stuff. And often these myths get perpetuated. We found quite a lot of research, for example, was among mainly 20 to 22-year-olds in Western places like America and UK. I've done quite a lot of research through Bournemouth University and another one in London, comparing some of these data and seeing, does the myth hit the reality? And we looked, for example, we asked about this claim about what percentage of Gen Z's claims to buy products or services based on ethical credentials, which comes up quite a lot. And it often comes up around 70% for UK. We couldn't find much support for that. And then it was interesting when we turned it to international students to look at it across other markets. And we found that, for example, certainly the USA was coming near 40, but down in like Nigeria, it was below 10%. Spain and France was about 15, India was about 20, and Vietnam was about 30, and Portugal was just over 30 as well, based on a small number of students. But we were finding that, again, these were in this age group, largely the 20 to 24-year-olds, saying that, yeah, well, we're not all like that, And I think what was interesting throwing into that audience was they were saying, yes, we don't really like the fact that they just put us all into one bunch. And as someone said, I'm 22 years old, she said, but if you look at my two brothers, one who's 18 and one who's 12, you couldn't get a more different bunch of kids. We're very different, and their generation, the 12-year-old, has grown up on a very different technology than I grew up, she said. So I think the thing I always found in the danger of this is when we put these broad groups of people and then bunch them into some big group and then give them some commonality. I think, why do we accept that? It seems crazy because it doesn't make much sense. We should be focusing much more on other factors of looking at people. But I think there's something hopefully that's open discussion. And we have someone here today I really hope will contribute later on who again deals a lot with Gen Z audience from the bottom up.
Yeah, and Chris, just to add to that, I mean, some of the psychometrics are really interesting as well. If you look at the different layers in terms of who might have a greater propensity to exhibit ethical behaviours. So there's been a lot of studies on personality traits that are linked to ethical behaviours, such as conscientiousness, openness, empathy, and agreeableness. And actually, one thing I didn't mention that came out of this research, which was I have to say was striking, was the difference between attitudes and behaviours by gender. There's a big difference between male and female in terms of their purchasing intent and sustainable lifestyle choices, leaning much more towards female. I mean, quite considerable. And there's been a lot of previous research on this that have shown that females are more environmentally sensitive due to kind of more empathetic emotional tendencies. But what's interesting, I don't think this is, Chris, or if anyone else disagrees, but I don't think this is talked about a lot, from a segmentation or marketing point of view. We don't really talk about gender, but that, if you were going to bet on something, that's probably something that is meaningful in terms of segmentation.
But I think something else it raises is about values. We did a little experiment where we asked young people in this group to write down their values. And then we asked them to write down their parent values. And no surprise, if anybody's on psychology will know, the values are very similar. There's a lot of overlap because often we inherit our values from our parents. So actually, as a consumer, values is a much better way of looking. And now I think there's a very interesting, because people talk about values disconnect and value alignment. Brands are realizing that in this ethical space, you need to actually align with people's values first. That's the primary thing. So just chasing an age group based on common statements is not the way to go. It's actually to find, and of course, go through any group of 100 people who are 22 years old, for example, you will find they've got very enormous variety, in what they think is important and what they do.
Yeah, and just on that, so one of the other things that this research looked at was the prioritization of ethical issues by age group. And one thing that came back that was quite distinctive is that the over 55s, when it comes to the environment, they're more concerned about food waste, excess waste in landfill and deforestation, whereas the younger generations, the younger consumers, they prioritize air pollution and global warming. So that's interesting, and that might explain why Gen Z are more wasteful than the over 55s, because they're not so concerned about it so much. So there are some distinctions there across age groups and what they prioritize.
I think also what's interesting, if you look through what the main influences of every age group, because there's about 6 main key influences for every age group, is that you'll find that, for example, like racial justice and LGBT are much higher on the agenda than the older groups. We have known from a lot of research that we repeat repeatedly and compare is that often if you split between planet and people, then you'll find that 2/3 is people, 1/3 is planet. Although this age group has had a lot pushed onto them around environmentalism and around stress around it, because we now talk about this thing about climate change anxiety syndrome among young people, which is quite scary because they've been hammered by people saying the end of the world is coming and you've got to sort it out, guys. And we're gone, we're going to leave you the mess. I think we should probably open it up to the floor now.